Love that stuff.
But he's been doing this AI stuff, right? And there's a program that he's related to that you ask it a question and it spits out a article. So he asked, what do you think about the current trend to have non-art historians be directors, museum directors? And it gave this,
right
thing, which was, it was fairly simplistic, but it was useful. And, but it's been that, like, and there has been this thread of comments like, I don't think art historians should ever be directors.
They don't think that?
Well, it's, it used to be the default, and now it's starting to change pretty dramatically. So.
Yeah, we're talking, by the way, we're now going to start. You ready to start?
Yeah,
Andrew
sure.
Walker. Okay. We have you're the director, right, of the Amon Carter? Is that the official title? I didn't know if there was a special.
No, that's the title, executive director. But yes, that's
See, there
that's
always
the one
is.
on my card.
Executive director of the Amon Carter. And Andrew, you've been there since what, 2010, something like that?
I came actually in 12 years ago to this month.
Yeah.
I came in January of 2011.
Oh, 2011. So 12 years basically. Yeah. So what do you think about being the director there? I love that museum, by the way. That is like one of my all-time favorite museums.
It's a great institution that has a pretty rich history. So what was funny about my getting the job in a certain way was I had known about the Amon Carter as a art historian in training,
right?
Because when I chose to focus on American art, that was the institution that often and during my graduate years was generating some of the most important scholarship on American art. So I just knew about it because they were doing the most interesting work. But that was broadly. By that time, for a scholar or for a graduate student in art history, the Amon Carter wasn't known as a Western art museum. It was known as an American art museum.
Isn't it kind of still that way? I mean, your collection's super deep in all American art.
It is.
I mean, I must admit, when I think of it, and I tell people, I say, oh no, it's a great Western art museum, partially because there's all the other museums around it that kind of specialize in other things. But, I went to the website and I'm looking at what's you actually hold, and it's pretty insane.
Well, it is. It's a master works collection, and that was the driving force of the founder. I mean, Amon Carter was the technical founder, but he was dead by the time the museum came and was birthed. So his daughter Ruth was really the person that built the institution, the organization, its mission, its vision. And in those early years, because she was young, she was in her late 30s when she took over this in Texas.
Yeah.
A powerful woman.
Yeah.
But in Texas.
Yeah. Filled with Frederick Remingtons and Russells,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Not the most soft world as you might imagine. But she wanted to honor her father, who was largely interested in the American West, and in particular, as you were saying, Frederick Remington and Charlie Russell. But that wasn't her favorite. And she had trained in her own life in the classics of American Impressionism and even earlier. And the first painting that she would always talk about buying, much to her father's chagrin, was a Van Gogh.
Yeah.
And he was like, what are you doing wasting your money?
And do you still have that piece?
No, that was early in her, let's say probably in her 20s.
Wow.
And so that moved, as paintings often do in collections that are evolving and changing. And when she had the mission to take up her father's desire to build an American art museum for Fort Worth, but regionally as well, she started to shift. And she was really quite brilliant, and she had a great board that she established early on. And Peter Hasserick was one of the first curators there.
Yeah, that's
right?
a good
Legendary.
one. Yeah, right, yeah.
And he and the team there, Mitch Wilder was the first director, and he as well was kind of legendary, more in the indigenous material, in African and Alaskan was his area of expertise.
What years would this have been?
This would have been in 64.
Four?
No,
Okay.
well, 60. Mitch came in 61.
Okay.
So that's when the museum opened.
61.
Yeah.
Okay.
And but a few years later, they came up with an idea that Peter helped to codify, which was based on an idea that Bernard DeVoto had written about in his books on Lewis and Clark in particular. And it was this notion of what was called westering, which was largely the belief in the American progression of populating America, that it moved west. So the idea was called westering, and that there was always a frontier. And once they kind of established that as their collecting parameters in landscape, largely, it was largely territorial. It was the idea that the land moved west. She found, and the board found it possible to buy Thomas Cole and Fitzhenry Lane and others that were more classically Eastern,
Right.
because that at one time was the West.
Yes.
So it was kind of creating this narrative through the collection that was telling a larger story than just what Remington and Russell contained. And then as that moved through its first almost 2 decades, but let's say the first 15 to 18 years of the museum, it then shifted to be where we're going to move away from the notion of westering. I've satisfied my obligation as the leader of this organization. This is Ruth. And I'm paraphrasing. I'm, of course, putting words into her mouth.
Right.
So take it.
Is she
for what
still
it is.
around?
She passed away in 2013.
Okay.
So I had the pleasure of working with her for about 2 years.
Oh, nice.
But then, and she was the first official female, but also, female trustee of the National Gallery. And that began to really affect her, and the desire to have an American art collection that wasn't tied to even this westering notion. And so really in the late 70s, the early 80s, that model got blown apart, and the museum started collecting more broadly American art. And
who makes those kind of decisions? Is that a board decision? Is that a Ruth decision? What is that?
Well, I tell you, it's a great question, because the way it would have functioned at that time, it would have been a combination of, strong curators and who had the vision to understand what the possibilities were. It would have been Ruth building on this idea that she had early on,
right,
that if Fort Worth was going to be a city of significance, it had to participate in the national dialogue. And so the notion of just having a museum to the American West wouldn't have allowed that to happen. So that's where that westering idea came, that gave elbow room, basically. And then as it grew and matured over time, right, the collection grows.
Right.
That the idea that Fort Worth has a premier American art museum of the nation became important. So she was moving that narrative. The curators were understanding that opportunity, and the board was supporting it. So the board, of course, and the relationship that the museum has always had with the foundation that Amon Carter established, really began developing a acquisition program that began to see the significance of William Michael Harnett, began to see the significance of Thomas Akins as telling the rich and nuanced story of American art. Didn't mean they didn't continue to collect with a sort of lean towards the West. So part of what would happen, and this, I don't know if this is a part of the story that you've heard about the museum, but many times, let's say, for example, one of the areas of focus that happened after that first 20 years, let's say, was in the Stieglitz group, American modernism.
Yes.
And of course, there was a lot of Western ties within the American modernists.
Right.
So the museum could build on George O'Keeffe,
Yeah.
it could build on Marsden Hartley, it could
Right.
build on Stuart Davis, and have ties into the American West, because maybe there would be, out of 10 pictures, 2 that were Western scenes, or maybe 3.
Right.
So there was this ability to say, well, the West has always played a role in the American narrative that extended beyond, the territorial narrative that was early established, to really explore an aesthetic narrative that was impacting a broader view of American modernism in those critical years in the interwar period. So the museum was very elastic in that way. But you could always sort of say, well, we are in Fort Worth and we are in the American West, and therefore a scene of Rancho de Taos by O'Keeffe made imminent sense. But there was also the Birches. There was also, other works that she would have done.
Yeah, and she did. I mean, you have a very deep collection of O'Keeffe.
And one thing that
variety
people
of them.
It's true. And one of the artists, this is an unknown story. Well, there are two unknown stories that I'll throw in here. One is that one of the artists that Ruth started her demonstration of the possibilities beyond Remington and Russell was Stuart Davis.
Yeah, you got some killer ones.
And we have 8 paintings by Stuart Davis, and everything he did reproductively on paper, as well as a number of drawings. So the depth that we have in Stuart Davis is little known. It's not as big as Remington or Russell, but it's another area that you could actually do a strong study of this particularly important artist. And I think as it folds back on Ruth's impact, it was the first modern artist that she brought in 1965, I think, 66. So, I mean, this was early.
Yeah, I wonder what that take was when she said we need to have some Stuart Davis.
Well, there's a great story because Jean de Menil from Houston had introduced this painting called Blipseniffs, which was one of the last large mural-sized easel paintings that Stuart Davis did. And it was done in 64, I think. I'm terrible with the dates.
Yeah, that's okay.
But it's somewhere in there. And he introduced it to her. And so it was one of the first major acquisitions she brought to the board. And there was like consternation, not in a bad way. It was just like, well, wait a minute.
Right, I bet. I mean, because I've seen the image. I know what it looks like. And it would,
it's New York, first of all. It's abstract. Yeah. Put it next to, Dash for the Timber.
Right?
Yeah, well, that's true.
I mean,
semi.
I mean, because you can recognize the forms and figures.
You can. And there's language in there.
Yes, exactly.
It's, relating to notions not only of commercialization, but also jazz.
Right.
So there's a lot of things going on, but very different than Dash for the Timber, right?
Yeah. Both great, though.
Both absolutely great. And I always fold this on to an add-on to the story. Is one of the first major commissions. It wasn't really a commission, but it was sort of a commission. Was Henry Moore's Three Totems is outside.
Yes.
And again, this is early on. This was 64 again.
Right.
And it's outside, so it's a signature piece. It's almost like a brand image for people in the city. And it's a British artist.
I was going to say, he's not American.
No. And, at the time, I've been through the archives on this because we took a group to London this year, and we spent time out at the Henry Moore studio.
Yes.
Because of that. And I wanted to understand the narrative. And she was presented with somebody saying, but this is not an American artist. And she said, but it's a great work of art.
Yeah. And it is.
And it is. And so, at that point, she wanted to also brand the museum as a forward, progressive, modern institution, which you maybe could do with Remington and Russell, but not so much.
No, and this is again like mid '60s kind of time frame that she's doing this. Yeah,
and the great final story on the Moore was she had commissioned, along with some local cultural leaders, a man named Sam Canty and Philip Johnson, who was the architect of the first building all the buildings actually, but also a very influential leader in aesthetics in America in that period. And I think he was at MoMA by that point. So he had a platform that was pretty visible. And they had commissioned Alexander Calder to design 3 Western-themed stabiles that were to be put outside, right? And he came to Fort Worth, and they went out, and apparently he was a rather rambunctious...
This is Calder? Or is
yes,
this,
Calder.
Okay.
This is Calder. let's say he wasn't he had exceptional behaviors that were a little outside of the decorum maybe of Texas at that time.
Yeah.
And which, Ruth alludes to in her recalling of the narrative, not in a bad way. She just said, he was fairly large in his personality.
Yeah.
And he made the 3 designs. We have the maquettes still.
Yeah, I saw one of them online.
Yeah. And isn't it great?
Yeah.
But they all rejected them. And they didn't really.
They being the board?
Well, Philip Johnson, Ruth, and Sam Canty,
I
was
see.
again this local cultural leader
Got
at the time.
Okay.
And so they never pursued it. So they had the maquettes, they just didn't take it to the next stage.
I see.
And then she came upon these Moors, and she said, "Well, this is what we need." And that's how the whole story. So the story was, it's like
Calder got supplanted for more, basically.
I need more. And it was when we were in England this fall at the studio. The thing that was interesting, Mark, was this was the moment that in the 60s that Moore exploded on the American scene.
Right.
So you could also see it as Ruth demonstrating that the Carter was on the edge of what was very contemporary.
Right.
For the United States.
Big time.
And very different than what Dallas would have done.
Yes.
I think Moore would have been a little too contemporary for Dallas at the moment, which is weird, right? Yeah. Because there was this whole fracas in Dallas over Picasso being too, too avant-garde.
Really?
And yes. So here's this, this junior Dallas in Fort Worth making these pretty substantive messages about aesthetic sophistication. And that's exactly what Ruth wanted the Carter to be. At the same time that it was being very respectful of her father's interest in the American West. So I don't know if that opens up at all.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And that says, so let's talk about the Marston Hartley or Hartleys. I mean, I love his work, but you have that early piece, the 1914, that was like a flag, one of his flag things.
One of his, the Indian symbols.
Yes, that one.
Yep.
Yeah. How did that come into being? Because that's an unbelievably important piece.
It is. And, this period of time so this would have been in the 90s. And 80s and 90s is when the modernist story started to unfold.
Right.
And at that time, the director was Jan Muellert, who was really the first outsider, non-Texas bred director. I mean, Mitch Wilder came from Colorado, but he established, and the curators at the time, which included Rick Stewart, Peter Hasserick, and Ron Tyler. And both Rick Stewart and Ron Tyler became directors. So there was this really close-knit leadership cabal, I guess you would call it, where they were deeply associated with the institutional history. Jan was a little bit of a bridge because she brought that narrative of a broad understanding of American art to the museum and hired Doreen Bolger, who you may or may not know, but she was the director. She was a Met curator, then went to the Carter for a period of 5, 6 years. And then she was director at RISD and director at Baltimore. So she was a substantive art world figure.
Right.
But she also brought, when she came from the Met, that bigger story, right? She knew it. And she helped build super important exhibitions and also super important acquisitions in that period of time. But Rick Stewart at that time was, he cut his teeth on the Dallas Nine. So it was that Texas Southwest story of that would bridge realism and surrealism. And at this time that he was the kind of lead curator moving towards being the director, he was fascinated with the modernists. And I feel like I'm putting words into his mouth, so I won't project onto Rick too much. But what happened factually was he brought that picture, which he had seen I want to say in Dallas. I could be wrong. He had seen it though, and he knew that had to be at the Carter.
Mm-hmm.
And so he worked super hard to bring that and the Deemuth painting that we
Yes.
have as well as kind of foundational works that would build that modernist story in a very high level, at a very high level.
Right.
And the benefit of the Indian symbols was, of course, it, put its elbow towards the West.
Right.
Which was something that he was aware of and wanted to have happen.
Yes. And Hartley was in Taos. I mean, he was
Yeah, he
there
was.
like 17, 18, I think he came in.
Yes. And you may know this, you'll know this better than I do, but he didn't have such a great experience as I remember.
You mean in Taos?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a true statement. But he produced some amazing
He
things.
did. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And then, one of the works that we have as well is from he had a Guggenheim to go to Mexico.
Yes.
And he painted, this is when he did some of his occult pictures, but he painted a series of super important landscapes. And we have one of those as well. So that it kind of, what we have in Hartley reaches across his career, not quite as the same depth as Stuart Davis, but again, very representative.
Right.
Which we also have with George O'Keeffe, which we have to a lesser degree of Stuart Davis.
And when
not Stuart Davis, of who's the other guy? The other American modernist who went to Taos for a short period of time. And
Marin.
Marin, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we have Marin from his New Mexico phase,
Right.
and then from his late works,
Yes.
which would be back on the East Coast.
And when you get these like critical pieces like this one of the Hartley in the early 90s, does that help bring out other pieces that people go, oh yeah, we want to donate to this museum because they have this, and this would add to, we like this Hartley, we like his work, and we want ours to be in the same light as that piece? Does that happen, or is it you have to get these things by buying them versus actually people?
It's a great question,
Yeah.
and it's another qualification of the museum's history, which we've been trying to change a little bit since my tenure, certainly, but because it was, and this is the nature of all of the museums in Fort Worth, although they're all evolving. But so the Carter family, Ruth, and then the subsequent generation of her children, of her kids.
And they're still involved?
They're still involved.
Yeah.
Not the board is, I would say, 30% family and 70% out, people who are not. So it's a good balance. But they're very involved in the continuance of the legacy. And part of that legacy that Ruth started was masterpieces, right? So the requirement until you reached a tipping point was really directed by the acquisition opportunities that the museum had. So they were board approved. They were often foundation supported financially. And they weren't having to I'm going to say it this way, and it's only over a period of time. It's not a rule. They didn't want to compromise by taking the works that others had collected that may not meet the qualifications of what was seen as the floor to the ceiling of the collection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get it.
So for the major pieces that constitute the collection, they have been purchased through the museum. And where that's different, because this is the second unknown story about the Carter, is because Ruth and the family, but Ruth, and it goes back to her father in a very specific way, but she really manifested it. The museum has been a center for knowledge creation about American creative experience since its inception. And in order to do that, she built up and had the vision to build up a research library that continues today to be the biggest west of the Mississippi for American art.
And is that special works as well? So for research, as far as it's things that like are donated to it, artists, papers and those kind of things.
We have an archive program.
Yes.
That has right now, I think it has 6 photo archives. So that's the other nuance to this, is that not specifically for Ruth for aesthetics, but her brother, Amon Jr., was a fascination with photography. And that bridged both the aesthetic and the historical, right? So most museums in the 60s, except for MoMA, were collecting, if they collected photographs, they collected them for documentary reasons. The Carter did kind of both. So we have a huge depth about the Western expansion. And several of the artist archives help to support that. E.R. Smith is one, the sort of cowboy photographer that we have all of his work, basically. And so you're able to show that progression west territorially from 1890 through 1925, let's say, through his work. But that also that led to other people bringing those collections, which were hugely affordable in the 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, in mass, right? You
Yeah.
would just buy I'll buy that truck full
Right.
of photographs.
Right.
And so the Carter had the wherewithal to do that and then cull it over time so that it maintained a level of excellence while at the same time could tell a rich, full story. So you could do that research piece of it that is visually coordinated with the Western expansion of the United States and the very, right? I think in photography is a medium that was intimately tied to the American West.
Yes.
More so than I think than the East, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
And so we're able to maintain that story at a very deep level. And then as that grew, I would say beginning in the 70s, it started to, and through this period of shift, it started to be much more driven by the fine art idea. So right now, we probably have the largest collection of American photography in the United States. Somebody at the Getty is going to call you and say, wait a minute. But when you think about it as an American art collection and not an international collection, and by number, we have about 60,000 exhibition prints and over 250,000 negatives.
Wow.
That maintain this story. But as I said, over time, it became much more aesthetically driven. And so now it's also being able to tell a rich story of American experience, but we've collected American photography in ways that would compete with what MoMA does, would compete with what the Met does, and we've become a center for collectors as a place where they want their work to be. In other words, they can be collectors who donate work and they can be photographers who donate work.
Right.
But they recognize that in Fort Worth, there's this museum that actually has made a commitment over largely its entire history to the medium and to its ability to enhance the notion of creativity in America. And so that's where it happens more readily. That when we do something significant, it brings people to us.
Got it.
In the fine art, we want to move in that direction, Mark, because it just allows us to be more dynamic. And so we've been in a process of building a national collector base who can understand that, let's say they're from New York or they're from St. Louis or they're from Tucson, right? Or, Oklahoma City. Or California, or where was it? San Diego. Recently, I was out, where they have those relationships with their local institutions where they may, because that's largely where they made their wealth, right? That they're very committed to those institutions. But part of their legacy can also be playing on this national plane, where at the Carter, you can demonstrate your commitment to American art in a collection through maybe one donation.
Yes.
That's all it needs to be.
Yeah. The right donation.
Right. If it's the right donation. We've had that conversation too. But we work on it. And it's about cultivation. It's about relationship building. It's about recognizing that part of the future for the Carter and its identity, which includes the American West. In other words, building relationships of Western art collectors means having a bigger, more nationally based committed group of individuals.
Have you guys ever thought about just taking your photography and branding it as its own museum, as its own entity? It makes sense because it's the largest, right? I mean, you said it is. And that would just give you a 2-punch kind of thing. It seems like it's a natural.
Well, there are operational issues, of course, that I
Right.
won't bore anybody with.
Right.
However, that has been part of an opportunity in long range planning because, we've kind of filled our footprint, physically.
Right.
In the cultural district. And then, as I think you were alluding to earlier, the cultural district in Fort Worth has 3 major art museums: the Fort Worth Modern, the Kimball
Yes.
Museum, and the Amon Carter. Amon Carter's American, the Kimball's European, and the Modern is, contemporary.
And then you have Sid Richardson's.
That's right. And
Yeah.
Sid Richardson.
I mean, it's got
which
an
is
amazing
great.
collection.
Oh my God. And
Yeah.
we love Sid Richardson. And we, because we have that overlap.
Right. Right.
And Sid Richardson and Amon Carter were, famously
Competing.
friends and competitors.
Right.
Yes. So they had, there's a rich story there. And we have very strong relationships, though. The Bass family is sort of the overseers of that organization and foundation. And Scott Winterowd, who you may not have met yet, but he's the relatively new director there. And he's terrific. He's bringing all sorts of dynamism to their program.
Nice.
But we see that as a friend and a neighbor and somebody who reinforces, a very important part of the story that we tell. But in that realm, when we thought about what's our 30-year plan,
Right.
of course, there's a sense of how do we expand? Do we expand? If we expand, what does it mean? How do we build our identity within the continued identity as an important institution of national reputation, if not international reputation,
Right.
for Fort Worth? And, Fort Worth, I'm sure like Tucson, is growing like nuts.
Right.
As far as population, which, I've worked in Chicago, St. Louis, and Philadelphia.
Which we are going to talk about.
But in St. Louis, that's a city that's so rich in its own identity. But they were always kind of looking to the past as one of their points of significance, largely around 1904. Oh, what happened there? Oh, yeah, that World's Fair.
Yeah. Geronimo. He was on the...
Exactly.
He was there. Yeah.
And, and in fact, the art museum there is the, one of the remaining permanent buildings. It was the Fine Art Building, not the whole thing, but the core of it was the Fine Art Building at the World's Fair. So there's a physical identity with that time period. But, it's always re-identifying itself as a kind of post-industrial city, right? Fort Worth doesn't have that problem. I remember getting there and they're just like,
right.
We're a can-do city. Well, we don't worry about, wringing our hands. We just set a goal and we get it done.
Yeah.
And that's been my experience largely. And so with the idea that the city continues to grow at the rate that it does, that its wealth profile is, changing and evolving,
right,
and that it has these fundamental cultural institutions that are so rich, it's like, well, you better be ready to keep up because you're going to have to define your relevancy as the relevancy of the city continues to change.
Right.
And so, of course, I would say, without pointing too hard, that you're very prescient and wise in that suggestion, because that would be a possible step.
It makes total sense. I mean, you're doing a big show right now on Indigenous photography, right?
We are.
Which is just exploding, quite frankly, as it should. And, you're setting those standards already. You have the material. It just seems like, and that's the kind of thing that could be branded throughout the country, right?
It could.
Yeah.
It could.
You heard it here first.
I know,
folks.
we might have to invite you to a board meeting to talk about, the rich possibilities and the positive acceptance that would have in the in the world of art.
Yeah, no, it's an important thing.
But it is, and your reference to the Indigenous show, that really demonstrates the ability for the collection to be creative, because the curator is a long-serving professional. His name is John Rohrbach. And he's been at the museum since the early 90s. He came when the quote unquote last artist archive of photographers came, which was Elliott Porter. And his job at that time was to catalog and organize it and understand it. And then he grew into a permanent position as the senior photo curator. But in any way, John, was really thinking about one of the great strengths of the Carter's collection is the Anglo presentation of indigenous peoples, going back to the beginning of photography.
Mm-hmm.
And we have one of the largest collections of native peoples, largely from the treaty groups that would go to Washington or wherever.
Yeah.
And there would be that whole group of photos.
I have one right behind you.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Dare
go
I
ahead.
look?
Yeah, go ahead. All the way. Turn around.
Oh, yeah. There it is.
Sitting Bulls right there, number 27.
I love it. And so his notion was, well, how could we tell this story about the representation of indigenous peoples that then turns at some point
Right.
to being about the indigenous creatives speaking for themselves.
And speaking to those events, actually, as well.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, the co-curator, the lead curator really with John was Will Wilson, who's worked in that space very much in his portrait photography project, which is extended for more than a decade, I think now, and largely takes as a point of aesthetic reference those portrait photos from the 19th century.
Do you have a lot of Curtis?
Yeah. We have the whole portfolio.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. You do. Yeah. You have the whole book portfolio.
We have
That's
the
right.
whole book, and that came, and just a couple of years before I came to the Carter, we had it, but we didn't have it as a single body of, you know what I mean, single work of art.
Right.
And so when the museum was able to purchase that, it did. And there've been a few since then. In fact, I think there was one even more significant by its ownership than the one that we had, but we had already had one. We couldn't justify buying a second.
Yeah, no, and they're rare, and they're 7 figures, and you just need a set. Probably.
Yes, we need a set. But it's, of course, it's a foundational piece of that collection as well. But what John realized as he was talking to indigenous photographers was it's not that they didn't understand that story, but they didn't feel the need to have it as a precursor to their story.
Mm-hmm.
Let us tell our story.
Yeah.
And so that really, and something that was very unique for John was he's turned it over. But the whole book that we've done, which is called Speaking with Light, is written and developed by the indigenous community. And of course, Will came in as the curator of the project with John. John helped him navigate the logistics of the institution, but Will worked with and made the connections with the other indigenous creatives. And so this project is unique for the Carter too, and has been part of our, you've heard a lot, I'm sure, about DEIA in the museum business, and the notion that sort of got forwarded at a accelerated rate with the pandemic and the social justice movement of 2020. This is part of we were developing this project, of course, years before, and in fact, initiated with the board's support a specific collecting program to build this collection of indigenous photographers. So it was supported by the board. That doesn't always happen,
right?
Where the board says, we're going to give you this much money and you can do whatever you need to do in order to fulfill this goal. So from the perspective of looking at underserved communities in our aesthetic or in our artistic holdings,
right,
this was a major
deficit. Project for them.
Well, it was a deficit, but a major decision on the part of the organization.
And why do you think they went for it? What was that? Did they see it, or was there somebody who championed it? Or
well, John and his associate or his curator compatriot, really have worked hard to identify that photography has such a powerful, expressive I'm powerful, expressive power. Oh my gosh,
Mhm.
I need an editor. But
Perfect.
the power of it,
Please
is
proceed.
strong. The power is strong, and that it really gets to a certain aspect of creativity that the other mediums don't always
Yeah.
affect.
Yeah.
And so they were able to demonstrate a case based on this years. I mean, literally, Mark, years of research looking at the outsider presentation of Indigenous peoples, to say, this is not the project we want to do.
Yeah.
This is not going to advance understanding or knowledge in the way that we could. But in order to do that, the collection has to start to manifest it.
Yes.
And the board understood that.
Yeah.
And they said, really, for the first time in my time there, they said, well, here, go at it.
Nice.
Which was great.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that is that about 80% of the show
Yes.
is a collection show.
Yes.
And
Your collection
is our collection. Nice. And I'm sure after the show, though, that will increase, because we'll of course acquire several of the works that are in the show.
Right.
In addition, and one of my favorites is by an artist named Sarah Sense. Mm-hmm. And she sort of, in fact, she was at a show at the Tucson Art Museum that I visited. Mm-hmm. In November. I don't know if that's still up.
Yeah, I think it is, actually.
But one of her categorical, won't retell her story, but one of her aesthetic choices was to cut up her photographs and then weave them together in patterns that echo the designs of her tribal pottery designs mm-hmm. and textile designs. Mm-hmm. So that when you see these photographs, you can still see them as photographs, but when you look at them, right. It's like something completely different. Right. And I don't know why I love it. I just
three-dimensional. It's different. It's unique.
Incredible.
Yeah, I get it.
And we commissioned her. So this was one of the unique parts of the show, which has at least this one commission. It probably has another one that I'm not remembering, but where we, worked with Sarah to design with a triptych of work that helped to trace the progression of colonization, right? Sort of pre-reservation and pre-discovery through discovery and then beyond. And so she kind of encapsulates in this triptych what the show is about in some ways, right? Which is, we're in control of telling our story.
Right. Your narrative.
Right.
Exactly.
So that's been super rich, and we'll continue that. It probably will lead to, we've had some discussion about seeing this also be for the Chicano and Latina community as well, because that's another deficit. I like that word.
Yeah.
That we have in our collection, where contemporary makers aren't represented at the level that we might show more conventional backgrounds of artists as far as that goes. So we'll see. That's not been official. So I don't want to tip my hand here, but that, of course, the success and the interest and the provocativeness of the narratives that came out of the Indigenous project are making us think more intentionally about other groups that could be identified as having something important to say about their own experience.
And I'm guessing this sets you apart from, let's say, the Whitney, because they're an American, painting, or American art. I don't know if they are embracing those kind of things as much, being on the East Coast, but it seems like they wouldn't. I don't know that for a fact. But
I don't know either. They do different things for sure. And they're much more, in some ways, they're much more immersed in the contemporary world.
Right.
Than I would say we are. We have a very vigorous, and really only in the last, decade, living artist program for sure. Mm-hmm. But it's not exclusive at all. And, we have, I'll describe another project that's that we're doing that opens in March, that shows one of the core beliefs that we have as a mission-driven initiative. Mm-hmm. That the Whitney probably doesn't do, because they're their sense of history is different.
Yeah, it's East Coast driven, really.
Well, it's
quite
East Coast,
frankly.
but it really isn't. It doesn't really extend much. It doesn't extend at all beyond the 20th century, behind the 20th century,
Mhm.
right? So it doesn't go back
Yeah.
to the colonial federal period. It certainly doesn't go back to the era of exploration.
Yeah.
So what we're able to do is, and what we've committed to curatorially, as well as, from a knowledge creation point of view, is that we believe very strongly, and this is not rocket science, that the historical narrative has strong relationships to contemporary issues. And so that we're aware that part of our responsibility in collecting the past, or even telling the past, is making it connect to
The future.
issues, right, of the
Yeah.
present and to the future.
Yeah.
And so one project that one of our curators, her name is Maggie Adler, has developed was taking a major work of art, for which I have a story, if you want to hear it.
Yeah, of course.
Of John Quincy Adams Ward's The Freedman. So it was a sculpture made by this artist in 1863.
Mm-hmm.
And it was largely connected at the time to the Emancipation Proclamation.
Mm.
Part of its uniqueness in that narrative is that it's a singular African-American slave or enslaved person who is demonstrating his own agency and his freedom. So he wears a shackle, but he's in this position or this stance of potential energy. He's about to stand up
Mm-hmm.
from a seated position, and it's beautiful. And the complexity of that sculpture in its own day was, as much as the debates around abolition and emancipation were as confused and as complicated as, you might say, the debates around something today would be, which seem easy, right? But right, there's a whole spectrum of points of view.
Right.
That sculpture never really exploded in the way that people thought it might.
Mm.
They thought it might be in every household, like
I get it.
the Rogers, plaster sculptures would be. There was a movement, short-lived, to make it a monumental sculpture that would live on the mall
Mhm.
somewhere, and that ended up being a different sculpture that
Mm-hmm.
showed emancipation, but it was the supplicant enslaved person looking up at
Yeah.
Lincoln,
Yeah.
right?
Great.
So it was the white man savior, so to
Right.
speak. And so what Maggie was interested in was to take the complexity of that moment and see how that continued notion of freedom or emancipation continues to be one that has relationship to generational trauma, that has a whole complexity that's tied up into the racial politics of
Mhm.
America since the Civil War, right? Don't even need to go into detail about that. And of course, there's going to be a range of people's points of view on that as well, which I've heard of a lot
Mm-hmm.
in the last couple of years. But we invited 7 Black American contemporary artists that are nationally based. I mean, we have a couple that are from Texas, but they're from all over the country, to present work that gives their perspective on freedom and emancipation.
And do they talk about that sculpture as
Some
well?
of them do,
Yeah.
not all of them.
Yeah.
Some of them do, some of them don't. But in the way that we've done other projects, there's a historical and even with the Indigenous project, there's a very brief historical foundation that then breaks out into the story that I've already talked about. But this one will have a historical work around the freedmen to sort of demonstrate how this notion of Black agency was qualified,
Mhm.
even in its own day.
Mm.
And then, of course, led to the post-Reconstruction era that sort of rolled back some of the progress that was happening in the years right after the Civil War.
And is this a show?
Yes.
Yes.
It'll
And
be
is
a large scale, it'll be a main stage, what we call main stage exhibition
And that comes when?
in March.
And that'll last maybe 4 months?
It'll last until June.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting in 1863, this is in the winter of 1863 is when Lincoln signs the the proclamation to round up the Navajos, the Dene,
Yes.
and takes them to Bosque Redondo and interns them to 1968 to 1868. And it is in that winter that they're starting their long walk. Same
It's
time.
crazy,
That's
isn't it?
it's
I mean,
insane.
that's the thing that's so fascinating about even the juxtaposition of these various narratives, right, that have become so under a microscope since 2020 for different reasons. Because, of course, people have been talking about this for what, a generation at least.
Yes.
At least.
Yes. More.
And is that this comes up, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this, because as I was delving into in the last year or so, my fascination with, and that sounds so, fascination is the wrong word, my commitment to understand more deeply the experience of Indigenous peoples
Right.
in their country,
Right.
is the power of generational trauma.
Oh yeah, no, that's real.
Which is, my sister lives and works in Atlanta, and she's a school psychologist in one of the most difficult areas of the Atlanta public school system.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, it's the same. It's the same thing. The generational trauma that she sees every day.
Right.
And the amount of trafficking, the amount of abuse. I mean, I don't want to make it only about that, but those aspects of society's difficulties
Yes.
are more visible in communities that have experienced generational trauma.
Yeah, and it looks like it's also genetic that can affect your genes too.
Yes.
When you have these kind of things, not just a cultural, but a real genetic issue that when you got little and big T traumas hitting you constantly, for generations, that's a real thing. There's no doubt about it.
It's a factor not to be overlooked.
Right.
And
Right.
certainly not to be dismissed.
Right.
And that's been the notion of some of what I think we're trying to present in real terms without qualifying the narrative.
Yeah.
As part of our commitment to telling American history.
Yeah.
Because I've always said this since I started studying American art, that, and maybe just because we're here, I mean, I'm in the country for which I study,
right,
or I participate in, it's always about history too.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about aesthetics. Where if you go to a different museum like the Kimball, which isn't to say they're not deeply immersed in the historical significance of the periods they explore, but the breadth of their commitment is so much larger that oftentimes it's driven by the aesthetic narrative.
Yes.
And not the historical narrative. And when I was saying that part of our commitment to history, to life today, is making certain that history has relevance in the stories and in the engagement that we open our community to experience. Mm. And that can be through coming to the shows. That can be through, we learned in the pandemic period the importance and the viability of digital engagement. Right. But we also are getting out into the community in a much more visible way. I've often wondered why museums don't count as part of their impact when we go out into the community centers and work with a group over a period of years, why that's not considered qualified engagement where we actually count the numbers. Now, maybe we don't care, right? Who cares? Mm-hmm. But it's still an aspect of our impact that doesn't always get quantified.
Right. Well, and it's not just a number quantification. It's also, you can change somebody's life completely, forever by one time that they see art or understand, oh, this is a viable thing that I get to do, make, see, engage in, and it's life-changing. I think that's the thing about museums, is they really can be life-changing. And when you're doing culturally interesting and retrospective looks, then it also can add to, the understanding of, oh, this is me. Oh, I fit in here too. It's not just a bunch of, old dead white guys doing stuff, but I'm part of this
That's right.
scenario as
That's
well.
right. That's right.
You know.
And I'm not dead, but I'm an old white guy. So I have to be
Yeah.
very conscious about, my position in all of these narratives.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And the one thing that I think part of the notion of diversity, and this needs a lot of nuance, which I'm not going to be able to do. But I also think it's super important to have ideological diversity open in the spaces that you present narratives in, where somebody who may disagree or may have a different reception of the idea that you're presenting is welcome.
Yeah, we call it free speech.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's not always popular.
No, but it should be. That's why America's flourished. It's because we have that. I have a question concerning Crystal Bridges, just because, they're an American museum. They've done an amazing job, right?
Yeah.
And do you look at them as competitors? I mean, I'm sure they're colleagues too, but you're fairly close geographically. How does that, if you can or want to expound on that?
Well, we love them for sure. And I think part of it, to be very practical about it, is we have developed a relationship that identifies all of our strengths to the best effect. So part of the story is that, and again, I'll be very brief on this, that Alice Walton was a very good friend of Ruth's. And in the years that she lived in both Fort Worth and in Palo Pinto, which is just a town or a county just west of Fort Worth, they were very close. And Alice was on the board of the Carter for, more than a decade. And I worked with her a bit in the early years, up through Ruth's death and then a few years beyond, where as Crystal Bridges began to be all consuming, her service on the board became more difficult time-wise for her. But she was super generous and really recognized the Carter's benefit and its opportunities and its significance at Ruth's death through a very generous support of the museum. And as we've grown, we've been in conversation, we've helped each other in structural ways, but they have huge ambition, and they are remarkable in the way that they're able to manifest opportunities for change, real change, both in the structure of museums, but also in this commitment to diversity and equity and inclusion. One of the programs that has become an offshoot of Crystal Bridges is something called Art Bridges, which is a way. They have their own collection. They're deeply aligned with Crystal Bridges, but they develop exhibition cohorts where a museum will serve as the foundation of that cohort and then develop projects out of their collection and in different ways. I don't even want to, they're still evolving, but that help to bring art to, which is one of Crystal Bridges' great benefits, to communities that don't have access. Right. So the Carter has become one of those foundational cohorts for Texas and for the Southwest ultimately, but let's say for now for Texas, where we're developing projects that will travel
but they are through Crystal Bridges, and you're a cohort.
We're a cohort museum. They support us.
Got it. I
financially in the development.
That's super smart.
Yeah. And they've really developed this as a model for replication. Yeah. Right. So this could happen all over the country, and it is. It's still maturing, but it is a super beneficial and important project. And we, as two museums and two organizations that can support through collections important stories about American creativity, we are using our strengths to the best effect. Have we developed projects together? Not yet, not exhibitions. I think that's open to opportunity, but we're also aware, as I think you're alluding to, is geographically we serve kind of the same part of the country.
Yes. Yes, and both have very strong collections. I mean,
Yes.
yours more Western bent, I think, and
Yeah.
there's everything.
Theirs is everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot, I think, important Eastern kind of things as well.
Yeah.
But and I think they're dipping their toe into native stuff at this point. They haven't done a lot with that yet, but I hope to see them do more of that as well.
I think they will. I think they're probably did the native indigenous came out a bit in their craft show, I think, that they did recently, and certainly certain indigenous creatives were in their larger survey of contemporary of the their kind of version of the biennial notion. But yeah, I think I think for sure they'll do more, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them start collecting.
Yeah, they're doing a little bit of it, but they haven't really, jumped in, and they should. I mean, both of you guys, there's lots of native tribes around.
There are, and part of what we've been doing too, just to build on that story a bit, is beginning to develop the relationships within the community, the indigenous community in the region, so that we have not only access to advice, but we can build the relationships that are necessary to manifest exhibitions potentially. And as I was saying a little bit before we started, we want, for example, we anticipate developing a relationship with the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, because the methodological approach that they're really developing and introducing to the world of cultural interrogation and investigation has already impacted our photography show. And, to be able to look at the material culture of creative living creatives, but also historical, is something that we see as a frontier for us. And we haven't done it that much. I mean, in my time, we were one of the venues for the Diker collection, which is now at the Met. But beyond that, there hasn't been a lot of historical presentation of indigenous culture.